Welcome back to Breakfast. They're meant to be your golden years, right? Post-retirement, less stress, put your feet up. But retirees looking to leave their retirement villages are finding themselves locked in when trying to get their money back, creating huge distress. Consumer NZ says an 80-year-old widow was left in financial limbo when she gave her retirement village notice she was moving out of her villa. More than a year later, the villa still hasn't sold and she's continuing to be charged her weekly fees and has not received her payback. Retirement Village Residents Association President Brian Peat says this issue is common, with numerous stories of retirees being treated unfairly by their villages.
It's quite common that people are not getting their money back within a specified time frame. And there's nothing in the Act that actually says that the money will be paid out 28 days, 50 days, 60 days, 9 months, 12 months at all. And so that is our issue, that is just completely unfair that the monies do not get back to the estate or the person. So we're asking 28 days. RVA are suggesting, well, we might consider 9 months, but after 9 months they might pay a little bit of interest. Well, gosh, and people still haven't got their money back, and it's still sitting there that the retirement villages are actually using those funds and they're not paying it back to the residents, which is completely unfair. We're not saying that village life is in dispute. We're really saying that the Act is not fit for purpose now because it's 20 years since it was put in place, and the other aspect is that some business models for retirement villages are not fit for purpose now either. The complaints process, it's a known fact that for every one complaint that comes forward, there's another 20 or 30 people will never ever complain, but they do have some issues, but they just do not want to go through the stress processes. And if there was a better process in place, like the residential tenancy agreement, that it would be solved within 20 days, then that would be absolutely satisfactory. Because senior people, as you know, they just don't want to complain. They just want a happy life.
So joining us now to give clarity on the regulations behind this is Retirement Commission's Jane Wrightson. Morena, Jane. Thank you so much for being with us.
Morena, Matty.
This is a complex, and I was looking at it. It's been nearly 2 decades, I believe, since the legislation was enacted, and there's been no full review in that time. So is our legislation fit for purpose?
We did a considerable piece of work a year or so ago looking at that very issue, because what happened when I started this job is that I saw 2 sets of people having quite vigorous debate and no real ability to resolve it. And the 2 sides were quite polarised. This is the operators and this is the residents. So we looked at the legislation and thought it has been 20 years. It's a very light touch regulatory environment. It's very much pro the business interests of the operator, and there's nothing wrong with that. These are businesses. But in that last 20 years, the rights of tenants and the rights of consumer protection have increased and changed, and I don't think that's been reflected at the moment.
I mean, it is funny you say they are businesses, absolutely, but they're looking after people, and often they're looking after people who are a little bit more vulnerable than a lot of our communities. So is there a funny kind of middle ground there?
It's a difficult area.
Yeah.
I mean, and I stress that the majority of village operators and managers are really good people doing the Lord's work,
absolutely.
in fact. And I'm interested in the economics behind this and the business model. So the business model is quite a tough one. Residents are not owners and they're not tenants. They're a peculiar breed, if you like, which is why the legislation itself needs to crystallise what the various rights and responsibilities are. It is time for a look. We've recommended to the government that whole system is reviewed. The industry is not happy with that. The residents are very happy with that, and I'm hoping that the review will kick off next calendar year.
So because there's that grey area in the middle where they're neither tenants nor owners, does that mean that they lose their rights, that they don't have a voice to speak up if something goes wrong?
Oh, they've got a voice, all right. And one of the there's several areas that are at issue here. And in our report, we looked at what we call the moving in stage, the living in stage, and the moving on stage. And the moving on is generally in a box or to somewhere else. So the moving in stage, there's issues around disclosure documents, complexity, and whether the advice that they're given is clear and that people actually understand the ramifications. That's hard. The living in stage is generally fine. People like living in villages, mostly. The moving on stage is problematic. It's problematic for the families. It's problematic if you want to move out of your village and move into another one because you've lost capital already. You're going to lose 30% of your payment in by default. You've got your ongoing weekly fees. So you've got to be really sure this is what you want, and you need to discuss this with your family.
It's a significant amount of money to lose.
Yeah, and okay if you're going out in a box and your family is okay with losing their capital. Not okay if you decide that going into that village was a mistake. You might find that the residential private market has risen so high you can't get back into it, and even transferring village to village, you still lose that 30%.
We highlighted that the story in the introduction of the 80-year-old who's still waiting for her money back. Is that a unique situation, or is this happening frequently?
It's hard to know because the data is difficult to find. It's more common with the very small operators. So people who, maybe a couple owns a rest home or a tiny village of maybe a dozen units. That structure will not generally have the capital that makes it easy for them just to pay out the money without having the unit on sold. I suspect what's happened in this case is that it's coincided with the drop in the housing market, and they're having trouble selling the unit. And that's when the resident gets into trouble because they can't get their cash out. When it's a bigger operator, some of the really big villages, I think there's much less of an argument to say they could pay if they wanted to.
You mentioned some of those owner-operators are fighting the reforms. Why are they doing that?
They don't think it's economic. They don't think it's fair. You should get them to talk about it. But the answer, as always, will be somewhere in the middle. To be fair, the Retirement Villages Association has been working quite hard with its members to try and push them into making some change. The Retirement Residents Association is quite fiercely marking out the other side of the football pitch, if you like. And this is why the review is needed, to try and reconcile these views and plot a path forward. It is not simple, and both sides have right and wrong on their side, if you like.
So how long will that take? How long will it take before we could get some kind of resolution?
Well, that's a matter for the government. I'm hoping they're going to publish the terms of reference by the end of this calendar year, and the review itself may take a year or so, and then the recommendations will need to go to Cabinet. So I'd say a year or two.
So Jane, just quickly before we go, what would your advice be to people who are looking in that stage of life where they're looking to move into a village? What would you say to them?
Just be careful. They offer a really good standard of living for some people. They're not accessible for very many others because they're expensive to get into. But have a good talk with your family. So make sure you really understand whether there are financial issues involved, and have a good talk about what happens if you're a couple and one of you dies. What happens if the family gets into financial straits because you won't be able to help them? What happens in those situations?
Jane, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for your insight, and we look forward to following this over the coming months as well. That's Jane Wrightson, our Retirement Commissioner. Thank you for being with us this morning. Nice to have you in the studio.
My pleasure.